Hey everybody, my name is Snitch. Welcome to another episode of CO Select. Today's game is a tier 2 match on the map Truth Is. Truth is a really interesting map. This one's pretty notorious. I think a lot of the other standard players aren't particularly fond of this one. It's definitely a bit of a weird map. It's got this really weird mountainous center. Only really infantry and mechs can contest properly. It's got this 3-base format. These 2 airports at the side. A lot of weird kind of capture chains and movements, this comm tower expansion. It's just a very strange map. Like the capture phase is pretty confusing and odd. There's a lot of weird kind of movements and minor changes you can make in the way your infantry go that can affect which properties you obtain. Because some are actually, even some of the contestable ones are quite hard to get to if you don't make early movements, and your opponent can very often just capture them before you can even get there if you're not careful. And it can definitely be a problem. Today I'm playing Olaf. Olaf's day today is that he's unaffected by snow, but in rain scenarios he is a little bit weaker. Obviously it's only relevant in the Drake matchup for most games with advanced by web, unless you have random weather on. My opponent is playing, Olaf's regular power is Blizzard, which sets the weather to snow for 1 day, and his superpower is Winter Fury, which sets the weather to snow for 1 day. It also does 2 mass damage to all of your opponent's units. Traditionally with Olaf, you want to save up and only use your superpower because it's super effective. Mass damage is obviously very valuable because it hits all of your opponent's army and it scales with the size of your opponent's army to, do even more effective value damage, depending on how late the game is, So normally with COs like this, you want to just kind of like be in an even state and then drop a massive superpower and take over the game in that way. My opponent is playing Sammy today. Sammy is a really interesting CO in tier 2. Her foot soldiers gain 30% additional attack power and also a 50% capture bonus. This means that by default, they capture 15 health on a building instead of the standard 10. And this obviously scales down. So essentially, unless you put an infantry to, I believe it is 3 HP or lower on the first strike, while Sammy is capturing, you actually can't deny her any properties. And her foot soldiers are also stronger. Her double time, her regular power, I believe it's just a infantry bonus. Also her transports get an additional +1 movement. But I had other direct units have 10 lower attack. So this is obviously a pretty big change with regard to how she kind of plays the game. I'll go over that a little bit, but going over her powers, her regular power is double time. It gives her foot soldiers an additional +1 movement, and the attack bonus is increased by a further 20%. So not normally what she'd go for, but definitely scenarios where it can make the difference in an early game fight. But she's more about her superpower, which is Victory March, where her foot soldiers gain +2 movement, an additional 40% power on top of her regular 30. And they also instantly capture buildings regardless of their HP. Obviously, Sammy, very famous for this. The HQ rush strategy of the 5 HP moving infantry, or the 5 movement infantry, capturing HQs regardless of their health, has, I'm sure, ended many a game for newer players. The thing about Sammy in these games is she's pretty different with how she plays compared to other COs. Obviously, her tanks are a bit weaker. This is mitigated on maps that have comm towers, which make her tanks regular 100. But she has much stronger foot soldiers, which means she's actually pretty much just an early game bully. It's very easy for her to contest properties aggressively. It's very easy for her to fight infantry battles, and always get very aggressive value trades in the infantry cap phase. This makes her very strong early and pretty dangerous to go against. You might have to give up a lot of early income against Sammy, or just give up contested properties that you would like to fight for, but you just can't until you get more vehicles on the board. Like, normally once the vehicle phase rolls around, she kind of slows down a bit, but it's very standard for Sammy players to be very aggressive in the early capture phase and take advantage of the fact that her foot soldiers are stronger. So this game is kind of a lot about that. I'm going to be showing kind of ways that I mitigate the kind of initial loss that you might receive against a player playing this CO, how you can kind of handle things like maybe mech spam, which is pretty standard because obviously her mechs also get additional firepower, and especially on a map like this where mechs can be quite effective with like I said, this mountainous center. Just kind of ways to taking advantage of other factors like, the how slow mechs move, or, like her vehicles being a little bit weaker, so you can get solid first strikes, they give you even more value, and just kind of showing you like how you can maybe limit the early game bully power that she has and find ways back into the game. So let's just get started. Regular day 1, triple infantry build for my opponent. This map's FTA counter is not only an infantry, but also the second player gains a property. I don't know what's different about this map in particular that makes this the correct counter. This is very standard in high funds, but it's really interesting to see this in standard league. I don't personally know the reasoning for it. I normally like to go for this property. You could like, normally you'd want to capture this one, I guess, as first player, but I like to go for this one because it's a chain of 2. We go for the same sort of thing. Moving these side infantry out. I've multiple times forgotten to build from this base, by the way. So if you do end up getting this map, always make sure to build from the side base. Sometimes I just forget that it's a 3-base map, and I end up just missing an infantry build, and I'm behind the whole game. It's not a fun experience, but not recommend. Obviously prioritizing my capture chains where possible. Standard early game so far. Infantry builds all around. My opponent goes for a really early comm tower, and this signifies to me that obviously gonna want to fight over these middle properties. Like I mentioned, Sammy traditionally a very aggressive CO in the early game due to the strength of her infantry, and this early comm tower signifies to me even more that that's what they want to be going for. They're definitely gonna be going for early fights and infantry trades where I just won't be able to keep up. I end up moving down here, going for this port. Because of the way my opponent moved their infantry, I think I could maybe capture this. Not sure this is always the right move. It's a very aggressive way to send your infantry out. It's much safer to kind of move on to the mountains and go for this central city. I do end up giving this up as well, because my opponent obviously has a direct line. I think I should have moved here to protect this city instead of moving down here. So I think it's a bit of a blunder. Do build my first tank. I built it to the right. To move up here and kind of cover these 3 cities instead of building it down here where I could cover these ones, but I just figured they were going to go for this aggressive push. So I built it on the northern side instead, but it could have been a mistake. And yeah, as you see, they do end up going for this aggressive contested property. And this is kind of the strength of Sammy, but I think here I could have been on the mountains fighting back, and it wouldn't be a horrendous trade. Oops, I clicked move planner. If I damage calc that from the mountains, I will get maybe a 6-6 split. So it's not, honestly, it's not even that great. So I guess I would probably have to give this up regardless. So maybe moving for this is the right thing to do, honestly. But that's what I mean. It's a 6-6 split. Obviously, my opponent has the comm tower. But yeah, it's crazy. Even hitting her infantry here, I wouldn't deny the capture because it would still have more than 3 HP, which is the limit you need to put it down to prevent her from getting a city in 2 days. And I'm taking an even trade, you know, it just feels pretty horrible around to play against her in the early game if she is being aggressive with those foot soldiers. She does limit this capture with this here. 2 mechs come out for my opponent at the beginning of the end. I end up going for this capture anyway, I guess because I just feel like I'm on the city, so I should be relatively safe in the trade, but I think it's probably a mistake. Just capturing more properties on the northern side. Moving down for the 2 cities here on the left. Looks like my opponent's maybe going to contest them with this infantry, but we don't know yet for sure. So they go for the hit. They get a 7-5, even though I have 3 terrain and they have 0. Like, it's crazy, man. Mechs are moving out to try and cover the infantry. But they do finish this cap, and I will be able to get a 2-hit here without the mech being in range to counter. They do have build their own first tank. This is another thing. If you are playing Sammy, don't feel like you can't build vehicles. Especially, like I said, with the comm tower. These are 100 tanks. It's not really the end of the world. And tanks is still far too important. Just because of how much movement range they have. How much threat they have on units like infantry where they take no damage in return. You really can't afford to be like, oh, I'm a foot soldier CO, I just won't build any tanks. And you see a lot of, I think, newer players who play COs like Sammy where they have like kind of a Sammy, I'm not sure how I want to say it, it's weird. But they have like, they think there's like this specific playstyle they have to play into where they only build infantry. And you don't want to get caught kind of in that trap and just end up completely ignoring the vehicle game, because even if you build mechs, your opponent could very easily just pivot around them. You have to really just force and kind of hope they don't build the artillery or the range units to be able to handle the push. Do end up getting the pick on the infantry here. So while they do get this aggressive city, they don't really have the forces to back it up, so I may be able to kind of get it back, so I'm not feeling too bad about it. Go for a first strike, get a 7-5. Thanks to the power of the comm tower. End up pulling this infantry back, feels kind of bad. Build a tank to cover these infantry, two more infantry coming out my other bases. Pretty standard stuff. So they do move up, finish this off. Ouch, they start capturing their port. Actually, I don't have the comm tower yet. I guess I just get a 7-5 by default. Crazy. Their tank moves up to cover me. They have a mech covering their tank as well, so I can't get a solid first strike here. They go for a hit with this lower infantry, finish their captures. moving up aggressively onto my properties. And like I said, this infantry here going for these 2 neutrals on the left, they're just really trying to bully me out. This is very standard. Like, they're always going to be pushing for these aggressive trades, always fighting infantry fights wherever they can. Sammy players always want to get early advantages, so you really have to be ready, honestly, just to give stuff up if you just can't contest it. It just depends where you can get your vehicles out, which kind of areas you can cover. But if you can't fight the fights, you have to just give the properties, or it's going to take too much of a unit loss as well. You either need numbers advantages, or you need just handshake that you're not going to get it. I end up going for the interrupt on this port. No units in position to counterattack. I do have a tank in this area holding the line, so I end up going for these captures anyway, because I have a terrain advantage and I have my comm tower now, so my return trades won't be too bad. I think I'm looking at like 7-6s maybe. Oh, sorry, 6-5s, I think. I actually end up getting the tank hit on this infantry anyway. Even though this tank is in range, it's not a huge hit, and I just want to make sure I can able to recapture this port, and it can't really be contested. But I am going to take a first strike here. Which kind of like I'm choosing to take the damage to not delay my economy, and this tank can get back to my HQ and be safe. And this tank is a little bit weaker than it would be normally against other COs. Okay, I don't know what I did. I think I skipped the turn. Okay, I skipped the turn again. Here we go. Right, round two. No mistakes were made. No one saw anything. So they do go for the first strike here. They get an 8-5. Normally it would be an 8-4. They end up interrupting this anyway, but they lose the infantry for it. Going for an aggressive hit. They get 8-4 here as well. Ouch. So yeah, I mean, this is kind of what I'm talking about, where I probably should just give these up. I shouldn't even be pressuring these aggressively if I don't have my vehicles in range to help contest. Because yeah, I'm just taking too much damage just for trying to take these properties. The mechs are moving along the mountains. The mech spam begins. My opponent just slamming mechs from this base every turn. I do am going for the 2 hit on this infantry. I take a first strike on this mech as well, get a 7-6. Always want to try and hit mechs with your infantry when you can, because it's very cost effective. I move this tank in range to cover this one. If they go for an attack, I'll get the 2 hit back. And I end up finishing off this infantry. They do get the port. Obviously, I can't delay it even with my earlier hits, but just doing the best. I guess this infantry taking the hit does open up this city, does let me capture this one. My opponent can't get in range to interrupt. I end up moving more infantry down, just trying to get a numbers advantage, like I said. Moving my infantry here to handle the mechs. I pull this tank back, build another tank to cover it if they chase. I end up getting a good first strike back. And just build more infantry. Didn't go for my T-Copter yet. You normally want to try and squeeze in a T-Copter at this point whenever you can, just to get the comm expansion. If you can get a T-Copter off and your opponent doesn't match you, or can't match you, normally can come out very favorably. So on maps like this, you do normally want to try and squeeze a T-Copter. My opponent goes for first strikes on my infantry. Pretty good moves. End up picking off a lot of my units here. Just really strong. Like the early game mechs are very hard to deal with. And the situation, it's not looking great. I have a little bit of an advantage in numbers just because of the aggressive use of my opponent's infantry. They're kind of just sacking them. Like here, this is obviously a sack. This infantry will not survive, but they just pick off my one. So they're quite aggressive with their trading, which is kind of keeping me even. But I'm still, I'm still a little bit behind in unit count post build, and yeah, it's just a little bit rough. And I'm definitely, already taking a bit of an eco hit with regards to what properties I have. They go for the aggressive capture here as well. I end up picking these 2 up, and I go for the tank hit. I do this order, trying to get this low enough, but I just don't do enough damage. So they're going to get this property anyway. I can't even deny it, even with a tank hit. And this infantry was blocking the bridge, so I had no way to get over. I think maybe if I'd hit this infantry with the tank, it might have been enough damage to do 8. And then I could have double hit this infantry and denied the capture. I'm not sure, but maybe that was a better way to play the turn. I end up just moving this onto the city aggressively because nothing's in range to hit it, and it's just kind of, yeah, my opponent actually built an anti-air. I think it was pretty interesting. I guess they were predicting aerial response on these mechs, maybe. So they're just preemptively getting an anti-air out. Yeah, I just moved this tank onto the city. It's kind of low, but it's just, holding some space, I guess. Not sure if this is the right move. I end up going for aggressive pot shots on my opponent's infantry because they have no tanks here to cover this area. Then I finish off this infantry, get another tank in to cover this one, trying to pull it off the city so I can get good trades. Moving more infantry in. The mechs are kind of scary. I built 2 more tanks, another infantry. Don't really want to go for a copter right now because my opponent's already ahead of me in regards to like the anti-air. But also it's not really accomplishing much if I don't drop a copter at this point. If I just sit here and play the tank game, this anti-air doesn't really have any units to hit other than infantry, which obviously is not nothing, but not super effective for the price of building it. My opponent's picking up more properties, 4,000 plus per turn. This was kind of a rough situation because, yeah, they end up going for the first strike and they move the mechs down to cover it, but it is pulling the mechs away from kind of this charge they were doing, so I wasn't feeling terrible about it. They go for the double hit on the tank, put it down to 2. They actually build a copter, go for an aggressive hit on my infantry. This feels kind of bad because it's basically like 1 HP of damage for 1 HP on the tank. So you're doing 100 damage for 7, or 100 funds for 700 funds. Doesn't really seem worth it, but I guess they're just trying to do damage where they can. They drop more infantry. What did they actually build? Do they just not have much money? It's weird, no? How did they... Sorry, I just wanted to see how they had... How did they get to 9k? Oh, they built the battlecopter. Sorry, yeah, I forgot to build the battlecopter. So they built the battlecopter this turn. Talked about it before. Normally it's a pretty good buy. If you could do 3 infantry battlecopter, it could be a little bit more effective, maybe, than if you can't afford to go for 2 vehicles. But they could have gone for 2 vehicles infantry this turn, which might have been better, like 2 tanks infantry. Just moving in, getting aggressive hits. So this tank isn't under any threat. I'm just trying to take advantage of my tanks in these sides where, you know, obviously, like I said, very foot soldier focused. My opponent's building a lot of infantry and using them very aggressively. So once I get my vehicles out, I can just kind of play to the sides where they don't have the counter vehicles. You know, there's no tank or mech here to cover this tank. So I'm just picking off these infantry because I'm not going to take any damage in response. So I'm always looking for windows to kind of like shut down my opponent's foot soldiers where I can. What I do here, actually, is, yeah, so my opponent sets up the mechs to get these counter hits, but then I just go for very aggressive first strikes on the mechs. So this is the big advantage you have over mechs with tanks, is that tanks have 6 movements and mechs have 2. So you always want to be looking, when you can cover, to be trying to get for aggressive first strikes where you can. You know, I even take a 5 to 8 here, or a 5 to full. I literally sack this tank to shut this mech down, basically, because once I put it down to, like, you know, 1 HP, it's going to be 3 next turn, and it has no threat. So even though I sack a lot of funding, I'm taking out these mechs, and once I take out these ones on the front line, the thing about mechs is that, like I said, they're very slow. It's very hard to reinforce more mechs once they're already away from the base. You know, this is already 2 moves away, and they didn't build on the mech this turn, so it's at least 2 more turns till another one comes out. So I'm thinking at this point, if I want to control the center, I just need to focus down these mechs. You know, my opponent has tanks down here, but they're kind of just covering this area, not really doing much yet. And they're also not as effective units anyway, as the mechs are in this matchup. So I'm willing to sacrifice a 5 HP tank into an 8 HP mech just to limit these frontline mechs, because if I take down this initial push, suddenly it's very hard for my opponent to get reinforcements, you know? A lot of Sammy players want to use mechs aggressively, get them to the front line, and start threatening your tanks and covering their tanks with them. But I immediately recognize the mechs here as the strength of this army, because this unit, it's not, again, it's totally fine, it's a 100-100, but it's not a 140 mech, right? These are the units that are going to be threatening my tanks with one-shots. So if I take out these frontline mechs, it's very hard for my opponent to reinforce them, and it should give me control over the center. So you see me even making aggressive trades there just to try and set up the scenario. I do end up building my T-copter here, and an anti-air ready to cover this copter coming in. Move this 2 HP tank back, no point letting it die for no reason. I guess it depends, but I just felt like I could save it here. The mech goes for the aggressive trade, 1 damage for 3. This mech comes down, gets a good hit. This one will also die, getting 2 damage. Tank moves onto the city to get another counter hit, or another kind of like first strike, I guess. This copter comes in, I moved everything out of range. These tanks are moving up to kind of reinforce. And then there's a small push here coming from my comm tower that I have to keep in mind, so I'm kind of focusing on this as well. But this is really close to this factory, so it should be quite easy for me to hold. This tank is still getting pot shots where it can. This anti-air is moving up, but it has nowhere to go and no target, so it's kind of just sitting here in the middle of nowhere. I guess threatening infantry. They get another infantry here on this tank. So I did take a lot of damage back, but the thing is that it's much easier for me to reinforce tanks in this area than it is for my opponent to reinforce mechs. And if we're playing the vehicle game, I'm feeling a lot more confident, because I think I can evenly play a vehicle game with slightly stronger tanks, consistently come out ahead in trades, and then because I'm Olaf, I'm focusing on my superpower. Focusing on getting that super hit, dropping the Winter Fury, doing the mass damage, and then controlling how my opponent can counterattack, and then just getting a really advantageous trade on that turn. So that's generally what I'm focusing for. At this point, once I've shut down this initial mech rush, At this point, I'm going to be trying to play just to stay even. Like, I am still a bit behind in economy, behind in unit value, a little bit ahead in unit count. I'm just going to be trying to push to be as even as possible. So once I drop Winter Fury, I could be in a really solid spot. So I actually end up finishing off this tank up here. My opponent probably didn't remember that I had one over here. Moving this unit, or moving this infantry ready to get the T-Copter. This was really inefficient. I didn't think about the T-Copter in advance, I guess. Moving my tank up to finish off this tank. Trying to get away from these reinforcing ones coming from, so I'm trying to fight upwards. Start capturing this property aggressively. Starting to retain or regain some of my ground that I wasn't able to contest in the early game. I even just go for this aggressive capture, try to just bait attacks with a wounded infantry. Moving more infantry down from the top side. I put the tank on the city to heal. Can't hurt, I guess. Go for the 2-hit on this infantry, finish it off. Moving my other infantry up. Tank on the city to heal. Anti-airs moving forwards to cover my units from this copter. And you see we're getting very close to supers. So the big thing for me here, there's 2 conditions for Victory March, basically. The 2 things you have to think about is A, moving onto the HQ and instantly capturing it. So I'm obviously focusing on my HQ here, but there's not many foot soldiers around here. It's safe to say my opponent isn't going for this strategy. The other way to use Victory March is pop it and just move as many infantry on enemy properties as you can. And just take as many as possible, because obviously it's a one-turn capture. So if my opponent pops victory time and they're like here, they just capture my comm tower, capture the city, maybe a factory, if they end up managing to kill the unit that's standing on it or something. That's the other thing I have to be concerned about. So those are the two factors I'm thinking about with Victory March approaching. It's just denying my opponent free captures, basically. Coming on to my next turn. This was weird. I thought they would go for the 2-hit, but I guess they just wanted to get the initial hit and then have the mech to cover. I guess I would get a free hit on the mech otherwise. Moving my infantry up. These tanks are coming up to reinforce. They do get a first strike on my tank. But it was a 10-9 and it ends up a 7-5. So you can see how the foot soldiers are a little bit weaker. And it does have an impact. I actually am going to end up losing this city. Get another first strike on this tank up here. But I am pretty ahead in, like, tank numbers, and I'm also reinforcing a lot faster, so it is something to think about, I guess. I end up losing 2 infantry here. Another copter's moving up from my opponent, another tank's moving up. They actually just drop a medium tank, and you know, like we say normally, it's just normally a good thing because it means you have a lot of pressure, and it means they need to just take a big income hit just to try and hold you back. So I end up getting the strike on this tank. End up going to kill the other infantry. Bam, Winter Fury, finished. Slam it instantly. Big mass damage. Finish off this anti-air, which opens up for me to get the hit on this copter. Really big value there. A Victory March is now available, so I do have to be very considerate about where I leave my units on this turn. Moving up for this comm tower expansion. My opponent didn't actually go for the T-Copter yet. They just got it this turn, so they are a little bit behind in that regard. I end up just taking the hit on this mech with my 4 HP tank, just trying to limit how much counter damage it could do here. Take the 5-5, walk in with my infantry, get no damage, nice luck roll. Move my infantry onto the mountains, solid defensive terrain. I think I also can't get hit here anyway, yeah, because of the plains. So obviously this turn I'm just trying to position my units aggressively, because my opponent won't be able to move very much because of the snow. Finish off this tank, move this infantry down to get block. And yeah, so not a bad Winter's March. It stopped snowing for half a second there, but it's back. Building artillery up here, ready to counter this medium tank. Get more infantry down here. And I got a B-copter finally, because this anti-air was just killed, so now my opponent has no anti-air anyway, and you know, I figured it was a decent turn to get into it. And my opponent actually just resigns, which I thought was a little bit surprising, but I mean, looking at the state of the board, this is the point where I was talking about, right? This is my win condition. Early in the game, I tried to identify how would I win this game, and it was, you know, taking a hit in the early game. You have to be okay with that. Like, I think that's the key part of this review, I guess, is just that, like, yeah, you have to be okay with taking a hit. You have to be okay with the fact that you're gonna lose early properties. You just can't contest Sammy. It's just not really possible because of the strength of her foot soldiers. She's gonna be winning in these kind of, like, scenarios where it's infantry versus infantry. You just can't handle her with most COs. So, you know, I take a big income hit in the early game, but at this point I have evened out the cities. They are capturing some back, but I'm threatening some as well. You know, I start to capture back some of the ones they took early. I've got this comm tower expansion way ahead of them. So I guess at this point they just felt like they were too behind on the tempo. You know, I've got all these infantry moving in. They can't get any first strikes here, whereas I can threaten first strikes next turn. I have the artillery coming to handle this medium tank, which will obviously be a problem, but I should be able to deal with it. They lost a copter. You know, I have 3 tanks to 1 in the center here. This copter's coming, but I have a copter coming. So I guess they just felt like they were too far behind on the unit count at this point. I did get a really solid Winter's Fury. But like I said, I think this game showcases well what Sammy will try to accomplish in the early game, what you need to be looking out for, and just kind of thinking of different things like how your CO handles it. If you're like a super CO like Olaf, you want to just be saving up, trying to get that even state, or as close to even as you can by the time that your power comes online. And also being cognizant of Victory March. It didn't end up coming out in this game, but it was definitely, you know, potentially a threat. And yeah, I would have to be very cautious, especially over, like, the thing about Olaf as well in this matchup is obviously once I pop Winter Fury, my opponent can't really Victory March because their infantry won't be able to move very far anyway. So it wasn't really an option for my opponent this turn. You know, if I didn't have Winter's Fury down, Victory March would let this infantry walk in, finish this one off, and the mech could just capture my comm tower if the snow wasn't present. But because of the presence of the snow, it actually limits this movement entirely, and my opponent can't get it off. But yeah, so I think this is a good game, just to kind of showcase the different styles, maybe between some COs, what Sammy will try to accomplish, and how you can maybe deal with it if you are the one playing against us. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for checking it out. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave it a like, it really helps out the channel. And consider subscribing for more content like this. My name has been Snitch, this has been CO Select, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one.